Welcome everybody. Good morning for me, good evening for others, and welcome to a new series. I'm very excited to welcome you to Good Fight Fridays, and we've got a new intro for it, which hopefully you enjoyed at the top there. This is our inaugural Good Fight Friday interview, and I'll be welcoming on Natasha Pulley in just a moment. And what is this about? Just to intro the series, getting off on the right foot. This is about authors who talk about social change and like really deep themes in their fiction. So this is the series I will be highlighting authors on Fridays this fall and asking them all sorts of personal intrusive questions about their fiction. I'm kicking it off with Natasha Pulley because I have read several of her books I have here, and she's been on the channel before, so she was game to come on and discuss such topics. And I love her books, and we're going to get into any new things that she might have coming down the line as well. But welcome, Natasha. Hello, hello.
Hi, it's so nice to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So the first question, which I was going to ask, is like if you wanted to say a little bit about what you like to write and what started you on the road to your first novel.
So, I like to write all kinds of stuff, and so I'm traditionally published, and this is a traditional publisher's kind of nightmare a lot of the time. You take somebody on for, slightly twee, magical 19th century historical fiction, and then they're like, I've written a nuclear thriller, actually. And then the next one is, oh, it's science fiction set on Mars, and by the way, there are space mammoths. And then, oh, I'm going to do an ancient Greek one now. So this is, it's very varied. I what I find is I like writing about really strange and interesting people.
Mm.
And that's a kind of formula. So no matter which genre I'm writing in, it will look like me because I write about the same thing again and again and again and again, which are these really usually the formula is ordinary person meets extraordinary person who saves them from their incredibly banal, boring life. The end. That's how all these books go, and I don't really intend to deviate from that formula anytime soon because I really enjoy it, and I feel like I'm probably working out some issues.
Yes. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm getting at when we say like what starts you on the road to this sort of tackling these sorts of issues in fiction. So I wanted to ask what your novels were about. We've got a formula. That's an interesting way to phrase it. And I see like the two that I have here. Okay, I can see how that fits. How about what you change is the backgrounds, the settings, the world building. What do you see as the particular social movements or like evolutionary change that you like to feature? And like which ones have you featured and which ones are you thinking of doing now? Which ones are you researching?
Sure. I mean, so I think a lot of the time the social movements that you can really foreground depends a great deal on genre. So if you're writing historical fiction, there are some things it's actually quite difficult to research properly unless you're a real expert. And there are some things that are much more accessible. So I think one of the really accessible things with historical fiction is queer culture. So it's quite easy to portray gay characters living in the 19th century because we actually have loads of information about that. We have loads of literature written by people like this and about people like this. So it's very easy to kind of to try and do a fair portrayal of what this looks like. There are some things that are harder to do. So, for example, if you're writing in English and you want to talk about slavery in Asia, that's much less accessible for somebody who does not speak Mandarin because you would need to research it in the original. So there are things that are really difficult. If you're writing science fiction, you can do whatever you want because as long as you can find out something about it, it doesn't have to be exactly a reflection of what's going on right now. It just has to be based on what's happening right now. So in some ways, you're much freer and much less shackled to real history when you're writing science fiction. And I think likewise, fiction set in the deep past, you can say, okay, well, there is no information about this. I have decided it's going to be this way or this way or this way.
Yeah, when you're talking about Greek mythology, there's a lot of there's a lot of interesting questions about culture and reality and spirituality and what the line is, because sometimes I'll hear people talking about indigenous cultures and how if we're treating their religious system as magical realism, is that dismissive? Is that you know now I'm going to use foregrounding, your word that just came up in my head, is that like centering white culture and saying this is not real, so we're going to portray it this way, rather than like admitting deep past, like things were different, and just like allowing
Exactly.
that wonder.
And it's a really tricky thing as well, because things like genre, things like magical realism are imposed on a book after it's been written. So I don't know about you, but I don't sit down and say, I shall now write a magic realism book. I don't do that. I say, I'm going to write a story and it's going to have magic in it. And then someone else will call that magic realism. So there's some extent to which this is actually not up to the writer. You could write something that takes these beliefs absolutely seriously, treats them as absolutely real. Unfortunately, we exist in a culture where if you treat magic, however genuinely believed, as real, we call it magic realism.
Yeah,
and that's not down to the writer.
label.
Yeah. So I think there's a labeling problem here.
Yeah.
Also, of course, it is very, very possible to write about different cultures very badly. So research is important. If you can, run it past someone who believes this. So sit down with someone and say, I would really like to talk to you about this. Explain what you're doing. So I did this really recently. So I'm not religious at all, but I'm writing a book about a Jesuit priest. So I went to talk to a monk who does believe this. And I said, this is what I want to write about. What annoys you about this? Tell me about stuff that's irritating, and tell me what you believe about this, and that. Like, really, like, I even was asking questions like, what is God for you? How do you experience God? Like, explain to me as if I'm a stupid person, because I am, because I've never experienced any of this. So go talk to people who know. It's not about writing what you know, it's about writing what you can find out.
That's good. That's a good line.
Yeah. And then acknowledge those people. Say in the acknowledgement, say, this person helped me loads. Thank you so much.
Yes. I was just going to stop and say hello to the chat for a second. We had people joining. We have Christy and Leslie. Happy Friday. Tiffany stopping by to kiss the like button. Thank you. We're liking and subscribing. Laura says, love a space mammoth. Laura knows. Saying nice. Hello. Maybe saw this go live on time. Amazing. I'm sure it wasn't the notifications doing their job. Something that doesn't sound like it makes sense in Spanish. Yeah, run it by a Spanish speaker for sure. JD also says magical realism often used as a label and crutch word to sell. So that's like the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, and this can be very difficult as well, because if you say to your particular traditional publisher, actually, it's not magical realism, you can't really describe it like that, because I'm actually trying to write about somebody's genuine experience of the world. It's not magic, it's the world. They don't often then know what to do with that. And they say, what are you going to call it then, Pulley? And I say, historical fiction.
I love that. Okay, Amy, hello. Okay, so yes, doing research on certain topics in Mexico is darn impossible because everything is in Old Spanish, Maya, Nahuatl, nothing translated into English or modern. Yeah.
So my favorite thing about Spanish is that it changes a lot less than English does in the same period. And I'll always remember reading conquistadorial accounts of people from Spain coming to Peru and going, oh my God, I can read it. It's normal Spanish. I mean, it's not completely normal Spanish, but it's not, it's not like trying to read Shakespeare
or Chaucer
in English. It is accessible, more or less. So yeah, Spanish is rough, but you'll be okay.
Depending on the time period.
Depending, yeah.
JD seconding sensitivity readers. Yeah, red flags. We've got Emma. Hello, saying hello.
Hi.
We've even got a Gareth. I think Gareth might be disappointed that I'm not doing a video on molasses spice cookies, because that's what we were talking about last night.
I'm sure you can at some point get an episode out of molasses spice cookies. That would be ace.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, people just saying hi. Oh, and Leslie is asking, as a booktuber who talks about reviewing books, I've grappled how to discuss some content. Do I use magical realism or cultural spiritual experience? It depends on the book, right?
Yeah, I really think so. I think, sorry, we can get very caught up in these labeling systems. But actually, I think it's okay to just show someone a book and say, I don't know what it is, read that. I quite like it.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the way that I hand out books to people. Like a really classic example of something that I think is generically mislabeled, like really famous things this happens to. My favorite one is The Exorcist. This is billed to everybody as a horror novel, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really is not. It's about a man who is really grappling with his faith and comes up against something that really challenges it. And it is, for him, horrifying. For us, it's wildly entertaining. The Exorcist is not a scary book. I'll fight anyone who tries to say that it's not. The movie is scary.
Okay.
The book is quite philosophical. And
Interesting.
it should not be billed to anybody as a horror novel. It just isn't.
Okay. I had a question about genre, which is sort of like, we can segue into it, the label question, which is mashing up genres. So often some of my favorite reads, including your books, are ones that have elements of different genres and bring them together in unique ways. And you're like, oh, ooh, I don't know, my brain just like is tickled at those combinations. I'm wondering if it's like something that comes organically from the research and the story that you're developing in your mind, or whether it's something that you're like, no, I think if I combine these things, it's intentional to sort of break up the familiar so that people reading are more receptive to other ideas in the layering. What would you say?
So I think if I were to do option 2, I'd be smarter and a better writer.
Maybe it's subconscious. That's all.
So my experience of genre is very much that I don't think about it until after the book is done, with the exception of the fact that some genres use particular narrative frameworks that can be very useful when you apply them to each other. So, for example, there is a framework that fantasy novels and speculative fiction novels follow, and it is that they build the world up very, very slowly, and then the plot will take off. This structure is incredibly useful if you're writing about anything that you can't expect the reader to understand immediately. So, for example, if you're a travel writer and you're writing for, say, a largely monolingual English-speaking audience, but you want to write about your experiences in Malaysia, you have to build that up in the same way you would world build a fantasy novel, because you're teaching the reader stuff. So that can be really useful to say, okay, well, genres use these structures, they use particular frameworks, and this would be very much in contrast with something like crime, which gets going very quickly, because you don't have to, in crime, teach the reader about what the postal service is or how the National Health Service works, or, well, for those of us who have a National Health Service.
Yeah, right. Shade.
Shade, sorry. Or like what the internet is. So
right.
These plots can get going a lot faster. And I think if you look at genre in that way, as different descriptions of the way that a plot is going to work, as much as what is the content of this novel going to be, they can be very, very helpful, because sometimes you'll sit down with a historical fiction novel and say, you know what, I need to build this in a very fantasy way. Or you look at it and say it's a period of history people know really well and say, actually, I need to build this in a crime way. So I think rather than saying crime novels have to have a crime in them, or fantasy novels have to have magic in them and wizards and stuff, if you say, actually, no, look at this structurally, how do they work? then I think you can get a lot of insight into why novels are very, very difficult to pin down, because they're using different structures from different genres all the time.
Some do, yes. Some good ones do. I'll say.
Well, this is what we want, right? We
Yeah.
want them to be good. And I think when you read what like we perceive to be a bad novel, it's usually because it's too formulaic. It's been done in this way before, and you know what's going to happen at all the major plot points because you've read this before. And you sit there and go, why did you bother writing this? ChatGPT could have done a better job. And you get very annoyed.
Careful. Yeah.
I know.
That sparks quite the discussion on YouTube. Let's see. Yeah, so I was going to ask about The Secret Revealed. I'm not sure if you're going to agree with me on this question. So
Okay.
when I kind of think of like if an author wants to get people thinking about a certain topic or issue and they want to like poke them in the conscience, like that's kind of historical fiction for me works best when it does this and it relates or parallels things in the modern day. And I get the sort of like discovery dopamine, like, oh, this is what they're getting at. If I have like a puzzle to solve or a secret that's revealed. And I think that the books that I love that do this, it's kind of like you have a mystery subplot, but it's not like a mystery or crime trope. It's just like there's a thing that you're kind of wondering, why is that here or how is that working? And it's not a world building thing. It's like a secret that you're going to reveal. And for me, it's almost like you're disguising the pill and the peanut butter for the dog. Like your mind's working away on it, and then when you get there, you're like, oh, it's so cool. I get the connection now. So is that a
Yeah, I think when it's done really, really well, that can be wildly effective. I've actually never read a book though where that happens and it doesn't really annoy me because
okay?
because okay, like so this is so I'm going to fight you a little bit.
Okay.
The reason I find it really annoying is that the idea of wrapping up, you know, the bitter pill of conscience in the lovely narrative fondant is that the author is in some way cleverer than me. And I know for a fact that 99.9% of the time they are not. And this is just it's like I go, by the way, I have got to where I am in life at this moment by being very unbearably arrogant. This is the arrogance coming out. You know, it's just like, nope, I will fight you. I am quite clever. And I don't like this idea of being somebody thinking that they can force feed me an idea that will not have occurred to me already.
Right.
It has never, ever worked on me. It has never struck me as anything other than really patronizing. And I really like, I think that if it's done incredibly well, in theory, it could work. But I really try not to do it because it annoys me so much. So if there's a way that I want readers to read a story, so if there is some kind of metaphor involved, again, I really hate writing in metaphors because I think it's pretentious and I think it's patronizing. But if there is some similarity in the contemporary world that I would really like readers to see, I try and make it really clear from page one that that's what this looks like. So someone will even say, "Oh, it's like this," and
Right.
I tend to do the opposite. I tend to try and just give it to people
Right.
as soon as possible because I want them to know what they're eating. I don't want to be Hannibal Lecter and like sneak an ear.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Depends on the reader.
But also, if you are not an irritating person who is very arrogant and easily rubbed up the wrong way, I can absolutely see how it could be really enjoyable to have the pill in the food. And I think it's just a very personal preference, isn't it? It's, you know, I like to eat my food in a certain way.
Yeah.
I like to see what I'm eating. But sometimes you want that surprise, and it's like the surprise in the middle of a cake. And I can definitely see that some people would love it.
Yeah. Is it cake? Have you heard of the show Is It Cake?
Yeah, and then people go around like biting doorknobs and stuff, and it's
Yeah.
really, and I just feel like there's no dignity in that show at all. I feel like you go on that show and you just go, that's it. My life is, I'm not going to ever try and be a normal human being again. I'm going to go around and like lick this doorknob.
It's reality TV. What can we say? Reality TV. And people read to escape from reality. So if we're giving them the same thing in books, I wonder how that
Yeah, kind of meta, right? Yeah, anyway.
So I wanted to give a nod to your forthcoming book. You've actually got two. You've got a winter one, Winter Spirits, which I've seen. I think it's had a long like lead up because I remember seeing it before, and then I just was reminded that it's coming out in when is it coming out?
It's out in October. The reason is that it is actually already out, but it's out in hardback, and then in October it'll be released in paperback. And then next year there'll be it's a short story collection with lots of other writers, and then next year there'll be another collection in the same vein.
The Winter Spirits, Ghostly Tales for Frosty Nights. So on Bookshop, when I look at it, it says the hardcover is on pre-order. Is that like a US thing, maybe?
Oh, it must be. The hardcover's been out in the UK for like a year. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm like, I remember seeing this before. But if you're curious about Ghostly Winter Tales, I'll drop that in the chat. And then the other one is The Hymn to Dionysus, which is coming out next year, first release. Tell us a little bit about that. I've got a little blurb and a question, but I'll ask you for your blurb on it yet first.
Absolutely. So The Hymn to Dionysus does what it says on the tin. It is about the god Dionysus. And it follows a soldier who has survived the war in Troy. And he's come home to the city-state of Thebes, which is where his legion is from. He's only been once before because he spent his whole life at the war and raiding. And he comes back in sort of quite catastrophic conditions. War is very expensive. The treasury is empty. Famine is coming. Climate change is happening. Everything is too hot. The crops won't grow. And disease is running through Thebes. And this soldier kind of despairs. And it's a really bright, happy beginning. He is quite a bright, cheerful person. His name means bright. His name's Phaedros. Years ago, though, when he was raiding, he stole what he thought was a boy, but really it was a god. The god wrecks his ship, turns everyone on it except him into dolphins, and says to him, "Coming back for you one day." And Phaedros thinks, "Oh God, okay, revenge." And he lives most of his life, until he's 30, expecting revenge from this horrifying thing that he thought was a boy is in fact a god. And so he with a sort of despair about the city and his life and all the rest of it, he prays to the gods to come and get him. And it's Dionysus, and he does come. And the book is about what happens when Dionysus arrives in a place. And spoilers, everyone goes mad.
Oh, okay.
It's fun. It's fun.
Nice. The very short thing I heard or I read about it was something about politics and madness and sort of, exciting the reader in that way. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. So who's qualified to talk about politics? I'll give you very general questions so you can run any way you want with it.
And it's so fraught, isn't it? Because there are different politics and we're all qualified to talk about different bits of politics, or are we all qualified to talk about all politics? Do we get to have opinions about everything? I think this is at the heart of an awful lot of debate right now. Do I get to have an opinion? That's a really, really key question for so many of us at the moment. I think with so many political issues, whether it is trans politics right across to Israel and Gaza, an awful lot of us sit back and we go, this is dreadful. I don't want people to suffer. Do I get to say that? Do I get to have an opinion about this? So I think that is actually a really pertinent question. And I think one of the difficulties for writers is, how do you have an opinion in a novel? And novels are long, right? They're 120,000 words often. And you're going to have characters in that are going to have opinions. How do you do that without sounding immensely partisan, without sounding as if you're standing on a soapbox. That's
Mhm.
really, really tricky. So I don't have an answer to that question. And I feel like the way that I look at it changes every hour. It really does.
Good answer. I'm thinking about a review I was reading where it was talking about how everything is allowed its complexity, and you sort of have your threads of different characters and how they're changing their understandings, and then you take a pen and you just like wrap the threads all around each other. Like, yeah, because it's a tangled landscape, and you sort of need to sort out what is happening before you can understand what they think, and then you have to sort out what you think. And I think, yes, that's making people do the work and like figure it out for themselves, which I think is
It
good.
really is. And I think actually a bit of a danger with that is that often readers will read your main character as if they are an avatar for what you think.
Yeah, your voice.
And that is a real problem because they aren't.
Mm.
And I think so this is where books get into trouble, right? So books like Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk got into a lot of trouble because loads of people read this book and thought that he was advocating this. And of course, the whole point is that he isn't. He thinks this is stupid. This is a crisis of modern masculinity, and he wrote a book about that. But people went away and formed a bunch of fight clubs because it looks like if you write a book about that, this is what you think.
Right.
And this can be a huge problem for an awful lot of writers. And now people read stories in the context of who the writer is, and I don't know if they ought to, because that
Is
isn't
that better? Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Does it help with the context or
yeah,
lead to different
um,
problems?
it leads to lots and lots of different problems. And this was something I was really aware of when I was writing The Mars House, because this is a really, really political book. So I had one character who is a screaming nationalist. So one of the main characters in this book is called Aubrey Gale. They're a politician, they're far right, very, very, very nationalist. And the whole challenge for me was, can I write this person and make them sound reasonable and make sure that I understand why they think what they think?
Right.
And they're in opposition to someone who is much more like me, who has, who's much more liberal, who's much more leftist, but actually whose views are also very, very flawed sometimes in certain situations. And so the whole point is that these two people clash. They're equal and opposite forces, and they disagree explosively all the time. And when I was writing it, one of my main goals was, I don't want the reader to know what I think about this, because I don't think either of these things in the end. So, but I think a lot of readers assume that you're writing about what you think, and it's often not the case.
Yeah, it's like just picture a banquet of boxes, and you get to open every one and see what they have inside, and then judge them or like think about them. The stream I was just on with Gareth last night, someone pointed out that my Paddington bear there is kind of a Tory, and I thought, oh, maybe I should take him out of my background. Yeah, we advocate by having it.
I think we can leave Paddington alone, right? I think that's fine.
So catching up in the chat, I don't want to go over everything, but yeah, Gareth was saying how much world building is relevant or useful. Brilliant observation, something I have only thought about subconsciously. He writes science fiction. Okay, we're talking about some horror. I don't know if this is horror or if it's something else. Maybe it's being misbranded. Yeah, Pat Pasta sounds right up my alley. I've got the links there in the chat for the books. Oh, we've got a question. I'm gonna star your questions for the end because I have a bunch to get through as well.
This is great.
Hello. That's what you get for stealing boys. Oh yeah. Okay. And Catpaw says Mars House is amazing. Story of exploration of other minds and POVs. I like that.
You.
Thank you. How about details of world building? So one of the things I like about your writing is that like the details are so seductive. Like they really let you into a different way of thinking to me, to my mind. What sort of world building details make an impression on you as a reader? Oftentimes I will love when people include food details, because to me that feels so personal and so personality giving. I noticed you also use like bodily awareness, and there's issues with like feelings about dignity and shame. There's all sorts of things that get filtered down into world details. So what kind of things hit you as a reader is really giving a big impression?
So I'm like you. I really love food details as well, because I think taste is kind of neglected in
Mm,
world building, but it really defines your sense of place,
mm.
right? And I don't know how many people listening have lived in various countries, but if you but I've lived in different places, and often for fairly long periods of time. And if you say Peru to me, I'm like pisco sour. That was the nicest thing.
Yeah.
The nicest thing. It's just, and as soon as you say Peru, I'll be like, yes. What I remember is food.
Yeah.
Even though I saw astonishing things there and learned so much, I learned a whole other language. But what I think of is food. So I think it's actually a really important vehicle for world building, to use taste and scent as well, particularly. But something that I also like, when this is a really specific thing, but when details that are very, very, very specific to that place are showcased in a way that makes that it's just like completely in passing, completely ordinary.
Mhm.
And it's just my favorite thing. So today, because I'm a normal person and normal people do this, I was reading Gawain and the Green Knight.
No, no, they don't.
This is normal human behavior. Okay, I am a normal. I blend in. Yeah, I'm not a transformer.
Yeah.
And I was reading it, and one of the things that comes through really interestingly, that really now sings of the time that it's talking about. I mean, it's set in an imaginary, like, Arthurian
Mhm.
Britain, but it's based kind of medieval England. One of the things that I really like about it is that what is just introduced completely in passing is almost complete gender segregation within a castle.
Mm.
So the lord has his friends and the lady has her friends, and very rarely do they overlap. They have
Ah, okay.
separate rooms, separate chapels,
Wait,
that type
yeah.
of thing. And it's not like, at no point does the poet go, and now in this castle the lord and the lady live very separately, dear reader. Like, that's just not, it just is made obvious very, very gently.
Mm.
And I love that kind of thing. It just details about armor and the things that the knights wear that are clearly very uncomfortable, that they don't like. It's cold to wear armor. So I think it was really, yeah, it's details like that really, really specific details about the world that are not kind of trumpeted to you. They're not portrayed as fireworks you're obvious on the
Right.
page. They're just slipped in, and they're just considered completely normal because they are. And then you get used to it as normal as well. That's really skillful.
Yeah. That's where you're transporting the reader to another world, which is great.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it's so much better, I think, a lot of the time, to, rather than like have a big neon sign that points at something and go, reader, world building, just let it go past on the periphery. And some people will notice it and some people won't, but it's there anyway.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really effective way to do it, because it's very much how you would experience it if you were in it. You would kind of notice it in passing, but it wouldn't be like major focus.
Yeah. So on one side, you like to draw attention to the parallels and make it very obvious what you're highlighting. But on the other side, you're slipping in like the different parts of the world and like parts of the personalities of the characters subtly. Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
I
I'm
think so.
following.
It's a weird balance, isn't it? I know.
Speaking of things that sneak in, I don't think I noticed this when I read Mars House. I don't remember it being like a big blaring neon sign to me anyway. But when I was reading back about like a description of it, when I was grabbing the link, it said something about catharsis. And I was like, oh, I have a question about something related to that. So when I was thinking about social change and social issues and injustices that we layer into fiction to draw attention to them, to make people think about the system and not be complacent, I do this. Um, one of the things I think about is this like freshman in college class about anti-theatricalism and the argument about catharsis. In our art, do we want to have people purge their emotions when they watch an imitation of life and then go about their day feeling better? Or is that a waste because we want them to participate in the actual society and feel better by doing real good deeds rather than in a theater? And I was like,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to ask Natasha.
Well, brilliantly, Dionysus is the god of catharsis.
Whoa. Okay. So if Emma is still here or any of my Greek myth retelling people, they would have been miles ahead of me on this, but this is something I haven't thought about in college.
And actually, I do have a really strong opinion about this. I am very pro catharsis. Catharsis, as you know, and I'm sure lots of people know, means release. Or it's a kind of, but it's not just release, it's like holy release. Yeah. And this is kind of in ancient Greece, this was sacred, and it was what Dionysus was all about, to the point that Dionysus was the god of the theatre. In ancient Athens, when plays were performed, they were performed at a festival called the Dionysia, because this form of release is so important. It is what Dionysus is. He's not the god of catharsis, he is catharsis. And I really agree. I think that is absolutely the function of writing, of all literature, of all film, theatre, everything. If you do not have catharsis in your story, it will make me want to throw it at the wall. And I think I absolutely understand the argument for not including catharsis in a story, for not including the moment where either they get a happy ending or in Game of Thrones everybody dies, and it's that moment where you go, oh, that was good. If you don't have that, you're sending people away from your story dissatisfied, and maybe they then go into the world and enact change, but probably not. Probably not, because people have a really different relationship with real life than they do with imaginary things. And I think...
Good point.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think if you're the kind of person who says, no, you know what, I really don't think there's a huge relationship between letting teenagers play games where they get to shoot people and violence in real life. If you say, no, look, people have a really good grasp of what is real versus imaginary, mostly, unless there's something wrong with them. And letting teenagers play video games is not going to make them hyper-violent in real life. If you're that person and you say, okay, there isn't really that link there, then you also have to be the person who says, well, being annoyed about a social justice issue in a novel and not getting catharsis at the end that's probably not going to make you go out and enact change in the real world. It will just make you get really angry on Twitter and complain about the book and maybe about the social injustice as well. But so I'm very, very, very pro catharsis in all art.
So Aristotelian. Right? I think he's on the other side.
It's yeah. And so Aristotle says, yes, everything should, he's talking about tragedy. It should be cathartic at the end. You should have this like moment. And I do actually really agree. I don't know if watching a tragic play about a son murdering his mother will stop you going and murdering your mother. But I think catharsis is real. And there is this moment of, wow, the world is better because I saw that. Even if what you've seen is horrifying, as Greek tragedy always is, it's always horrifying. Everybody gets dismembered and scattered around and murdered and all the rest of it. But you cannot argue that it is cathartic, and I think it's deeply satisfying. And I would really want people to come away from my books feeling like that.
So is the modern clapback the fact that, well, if you are satisfied with the conclusion in the imaginary world, then that gives you practice for how you can enact it in the real world, because you're seeing people get their agency and make changes in their life. And that's not tragedy often.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm processing as I go here.
I think that's a really good point. And
Yeah.
but I think also that with regard to social justice issue, literature goes through two stages, right? Stage one is highlighting what the issue actually is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, like, so for example, like to take the gay rights movement, right? So we are so far beyond this now. But at the time that Annie Proulx was writing Brokeback Mountain, what she had to show was the severity of the problem, because a lot of people didn't understand the severity of the problem. So she wrote this tragedy where you can't read that story and not cry at the end when Ennis is alone in a caravan. Like you can't. It's just so awful. Like, so that's stage one. You have to show what the problem is. But stage two, I think you have to do catharsis and you have to say, this is the solution. You can't just complain endlessly about the problem. And the solution, of course, is to write stories where, drum roll, the gays don't die at the end, where people get their happily ever afters, and marriages work, and people get to, they get to look after a baby like they wanted to. And so that's, I think, stage two of that social justice movement. Stage one, say what the problem is. Stage two, here's the solution. Here's what we want it to look like. But you can't have stage two until you've done stage one, or people don't understand.
Yeah. Does it have to be in the same book?
No, I don't think so. But a great example of someone who's done both of those things is Margaret Atwood, right? So The Handmaid's Tale, bleak as hell, no catharsis. The Testaments, loads of catharsis.
Oh, okay. Wow. I'm gonna have to look into that because I read The Handmaid's Tale quite a while ago, and I haven't read the Testament. So
it's brilliant. It's so much better than The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale is so bleak. It's just like, being a woman's rubbish, right? And we'll all get killed. Whereas the Testaments is like revenge.
All right. Okay. Well, now you've sold me. Okay. So, and leading directly from like being a reader who likes catharsis, on A Mighty Blaze, the thoughtful bro is Mark Cecil, and he interviews folks for litfic generally, and sometimes like speculative fiction too. And his final question is always, what is the feeling you want readers to have after they finish your book? And so I thought, that's interesting. Is that what you're thinking of as a guiding principle when you're writing, or is that something you're like not worried about, like genre? It's just something off to the side and you're sort of just like channeling the story elements as you go? How does that?
So I definitely do think about it. Like this is one of the few reader experiences that I definitely do think about. Usually I'm completely deaf to it and I'm garbage at working it into the book. But I do really think about how I want people to feel at the end. And I always want it to be a positive feeling. I don't want people to come away from a book of mine feeling depressed, feeling like the world is bad. I want them to come away from the book feeling like things are better because of the book. So that's really, really important to me. And this is a really weird thing to say, but I've written about this before. I've written about synesthesia, which is, like seeing sounds and sounds being colors and all the rest of it. But this is very much how I think about writing. So the final scene in a book is like a chord on an organ. And if you can get it to work right, it's going to sound perfect and complete and finished, like the end of a piece of Renaissance music. If you get it if it's discordant and you don't do catharsis, it's kind of brown. It's like it's a really nasty note to finish on. So, and that's like, I definitely perceive it in the same way.
Interesting.
That was nonsense. I know it was nonsense, but it made sense in my brain. I'm really sorry.
No, like what it makes me think of, this is like my free association brain. I was helping harvest on a farm yesterday, and we were going for cherry tomatoes, and you had to get them at the right color. And if they were a little too red, they would be what the farmer described as dank. You don't want that dank, overripe tomato taste. And I was like, okay, I was trying to interpret that. Just made me laugh.
Yeah, I definitely have had a dank tomato in the past. Definitely.
Dank. I think it was his like punk 80s like approach as well. What about, okay, I've got one question in the chat and then I'm going to ask mine and then that one. What about the advice to meet people where they are? So I hear this a lot in activism circles, and I'm wondering, when we're writing on social issues and social critique, is that going to the magic? So because it's like you're allowed to dream bigger and like be more fantastical, or is that like TV? Is that getting it adapted for the screen because that's where people spend most of their escapist hours? How do you interpret that advice, or what do you think of it?
So I don't think I've heard this before. Meet people where they are. What does that mean?
Well, actually, it's usually meet people where they're at, but I changed it because I can't deal with the preposition at the end. Um, Basically, like, you can't organize something in a perfect way that you want to see it a certain way. You have to get people when they're, busy after a long day of work. So if they can join a Zoom for 20 minutes instead of coming to a march, or if you want to educate people, you don't have it at the library that's the furthest away from the commuter lines. Make it easier for people, because that will enable them to act better, or not better, but like more easily. So that's what I guess I mean.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it can be quite hard to apply it to novels because these are portable, right? In a way that movies are not so much. I mean, I guess now you can take a movie with you, but you can't yet, take it everywhere. You can take a novel.
Is Google Glass still a thing? Like, do people watch movies and they're like glasses? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit tricky for novels. I think where it does come in for novels is acknowledge that people don't have infinite time for stuff. One of the things that I think loads of people really struggle about with like super, super, super high literature, things like Ulysses by James Joyce, which those of you who are literature graduates suffered through. I don't think anyone enjoys it. You suffered through it, right? Yeah, I'm old enough now to not worry about having opinions. The problem with books like that is that they're absolutely vast. And they really rely on you being able to do this for hours and hours and hours a day, and not remember and not forget what happened 800 pages ago. This is really tricky, and I think particularly for modern novelists, it is a good idea to bear in mind that the more impenetrable your prose, the more you go on, the longer every scene is, the more likely the reader is to stop reading at some point, break, and then when they come back to the scene, they will have forgotten how it began. So I think there is something to be said here about just bear in mind that people don't have infinite attention. Readers do have really long attention spans, and there's a lot of stuff at the moment about the kids don't read anymore. They definitely do. They definitely do. But the books that they do read, as you say, they meet them where they are, and that is often with shorter scenes, with shorter chapters than something like, say, Jane Eyre.
Right.
And that's fair enough. So
Right.
so do that. And it's just about slightly changing a framework, and that's entirely possible, I think.
I like that. So you're talking about structure as a more meeting people where they are for attention spans, instead of where I was going with it, which is like the cover's got to look a certain way to get people to pick it up. And then, like, you've got to have certain elements to get people to be like, oh, I could read that. I bet I'd enjoy that. Again, coaxing them in. So whatever wiles you have.
I mean, it's an interesting contrast here between traditional publishing and self-publishing. So because I'm traditionally published, I do have some input about things like covers, but limited. Whereas a self-published writer is in entire control of that. So perhaps there is more of, you have more of an ability to meet people where they are if you are self-published.
Right. If I knew where they were, if I had all the market research, yeah. So Amy said, good point. I didn't love The Handmaid's Tale, and I do think it was because of the lack of catharsis. So maybe Amy and I will be reading the Testaments together.
Testaments is worth it because it's completely different.
Yeah. You bite a dank tomato and want to punch a wall.
Feel the same about novels with no catharsis. Punch the wall.
Final chord of the kingdoms was perfection. There you go. Yay.
I tried really hard in that book.
That's on my list. I mean, I've got all your backlist to enjoy. Hannah coming in to say hello. Just want to thank you for the joy and solace your novels have given me. You're one of my favorite authors. Same, Hannah. Read anything you write. You must have a brain like a planet.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I mean, my head is going to be the size of a planet at this rate.
There you go.
No,
Okay, so
thank you. That's really kind.
and a couple audience questions. So Hannah, different Hannah Evans, you said, do you like to write about interesting people? Do you come up with your characters before you've decided plot and setting, or vice versa? What starts the process for you?
This is just such a good question. And I think it's one of the things that lots of people really worry about when they write. And I feel like there are lots of writers out there who plan. You know, they plan and plan and plan. There's like a 30-page plan. One of my friends, she's called Elodie Harper, she does this. It really scares me. I can't do that.
Great. Yeah.
Awful. So what ends up happening with me is I will always have a character first who I'm interested in. And often they'll just kind of hang in space and there's no story around them. The story has to be built around them. And the definitely character comes first. And like a great example of this, my very, very first book, it's called The Watchmaker of Filigree Street. The main character is a watchmaker who can remember the future. And that was the first line I ever wrote. It started out as a short story about this odd man who makes weird clockwork. And the first line I ever wrote was Kate Amori could remember the future. So it definitely starts with characters. I had no idea where that story was going. No idea.
Is it usually the extraordinary character or the ordinary character?
It's the extraordinary character usually. And that means as well that they actually often don't get introduced until chapter 3. So I'm always starting at what becomes chapter 3.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. Oh, man, that's cool. That's cool to know.
It's weird and counterintuitive, but it's kind of sort of grows. I find that stories grow outwards like moss. So like the start of the line is not the start of the idea. It's the start of the idea is going to be somewhere in the middle.
You just mentioned moss, so like
is moss your thing?
Fangirl moment is complete. So we've got some other people like looking to read your books, which is great. I've wanted to read your books for a while. Thank you for the conversation. Good bump from my brain. Yeah, Cat Paw says you will not be disappointed. Definitely pick them up. And then JD had a question. Have you ever written something you could have sworn was going to be problematic and nothing happened, yet people kicked off about another thing?
Oh my God, yes. So much. I was so scared when The Mars House came out because I was worried that people were going to call me a bad feminist because there are literally no women in it. Everybody is non-binary. And the main narrator is he, him. I really thought people were going to come for me for that. I thought maybe there would be people who thought that I shouldn't be writing about this because I don't identify as non-binary and I use she, her pronouns. That's what I thought the problem was going to be. The actual problem turned out that I'm a British person and I think in a British way. And my editor is a US person who thinks in an American way. And she read the whole story, which is about a man in a relationship with a non-binary person. And there are no women in this story at all. She read this and said, oh, this is a pro-life metaphor, right? You're pro-life. You're like anti-abortion. I was like, I'm what?
What? What?
And there was this huge misunderstanding. She had read this entire book as a metaphor for something I don't think about because the abortion debate isn't really a debate in the UK. It's done in a much more done way anyway than it is in the US.
Oh boy.
So this was just not something that was on my radar, and my editor read it completely differently. And in the end, when I said, oh, you know, what made you read it like that? It was that every now and then I'd said choice, and that was it.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's nuts.
You hit on a great question. I would never have guessed that. Wow. Okay. Let's see. Wow. People will read and find what they want.
Yeah. They will.
Yeah. And then Marceline, welcome. Reading your books got me back into writing. Really cool to hear you talk about your process and everything. Yay.
I'm so pleased. Keep going.
Yeah. So we're about at the end of the hour. I was just gonna look and see if I had any more questions in the chat or on my list. And favorite fictional hero from childhood. Do you have a story about like early reading that like predicts your writing career? That's what I was kind of poking at to see if we could have a fun look back.
I grew up reading Terry Pratchett, and I think
Okay.
I think you can see Sir Terry's fingerprints all over my work, because he's one of the main reasons that I try and be funny when I write, because I loved it so much. Like I think it's very, very easy to be extremely serious about serious issues. I think it is incredibly difficult to be funny about serious issues, but I think books that manage to be funny about serious issues are incredibly readable, and that's really what I wanted to do. My favorite book ever in the world, ever written, I think he was robbed. He did not win some kind of prize for this.
Yeah.
It's Small Gods.
Okay.
It's an absolutely amazing book. It's about the Spanish Inquisition, but it is just joyful, and it's so funny, and it's about a talking tortoise, and it's ridiculous and serious and philosophical and funny all at the same time. Like, you don't have to be po-faced in order to be serious. You can be serious and funny at the same time, and Terry Pratchett is an absolutely perfect example of that. In my later life now, if I have a moral quandary or something is annoying me or I'm upset about something, the question that I still ask myself is, what would Granny Weatherwax do? That is always the answer.
Nice. Oh my gosh. I was gonna say it's either that question or you go to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, apparently. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, normal person reading,
Totally.
not a transformer.
Totally. Oh, and then we're led off into like the Monty Python world. Yeah. Small Gods. Okay, that's not
Nobody expects
my
the
radar,
Spanish
so I will definitely have to pick up Small Gods. All right. Well, if any of the booktubers out there are getting ideas, talk to me. Call me. That would be really fun. Let's see. Final thoughts when we're closing out here. We had some great discussions. I wanted to highlight we have Winter Spirits, which is ghost stories coming out for winter. If you want to check that out in paperback, we've got The Hymn to Dionysus on pre-order for next spring, which is God's madness, struggle. I probably see PTSD a little bit in there and like lots of interesting issues. That sounds really good. And then the reason I'm doing this series about like social injustice in fiction and how do we marry the two and like why are we getting into this as writers is to do with my book that's coming out this fall. And if you are curious about this historical fiction that's going to tackle some 19th century Glasgow characters and deal with some of these issues, you can follow for free on Patreon for updates to the title, the cover, and all these sort of reveals as we go in the next few months. So please check that out. Anything else you want to leave our listening audience with in terms of what to read?
What to read? So, with regard to things like social justice?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? But I think it's always useful to read something that is going to make you laugh as well as something that's trying to go for justice. And one of the most joyful social justice books I've ever read actually won the Nobel Prize. It is called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote it in a gulag. It sounds like it's going to be really, really depressing, and it actually isn't. It's about the joy of being human and finding things to love and enjoy, even in the worst conditions. It's one of the most uplifting books I've ever read, but it also did amazing work of casting light onto the absolute unfairness of the Russian prison system. So there we go.
Yeah. That sounds fantastic. That's a great.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, Well, thank you for being a guest on the show to kick off Good Fight Fridays, and hopefully people will join us for future authors on the show. We had people coming in and being lovely and leaving comments. Went by so fast. Yep, got to get back to work. Thank you, JD, for stopping in. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Natasha. And yeah, with that, we'll wrap up and say goodbye, everybody. Happy reading. Again, call us if you want to do a buddy read of any of these recommendations. They sound amazing. So take care, everybody.